Hello again, economics students. Today we're going to talk about not micro but macroeconomic supply and demand. There are some similarities and some differences to what we've done before. We're going to start out the same with the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. This time the measure of quantity is called GDP, or gross domestic product, along the horizontal axis. Along the vertical axis, we're going to measure CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. And in the mini lecture on supply and demand, you can find more information about those things. Check the chapters for more information. Then, the supply curve itself has three distinct stages, at least to begin with. There's a horizontal section, an upward sloping section, and a vertical section. We call that AS. Rather than just supply, this time it stands for aggregate supply. That's only the supply curve so far. Now we have to add in the demand. And because this is not a straight line, we can have more than one intersection of supply and demand. That's different than what we saw when we did the micro unit. So let's try aggregate demand here at aggregate demand 1. Now, just like we did before, we're going to go down to the quantity axis. This is the first GDP, and this is the first CPI, or Consumer Price Index, measure of inflation. So between 0 and AD1, the first GDP has increased from 0. So we have some GDP, some amount of goods and services being produced in the society. If we move then from AD1 up to AD2, still on the horizontal section, let's do that and see what that would mean. AD2 then could be here. That would mean that GDP2 would be here. That's more GDP than before. So that would be another way of saying that there's growth in the economy. Another thing to notice is that GDP and jobs go together. More GDP means more jobs. If GDP declines, that means somebody's getting laid off somewhere in the macroeconomy. And this time we got more GDP growth without any change at all in the CPI. So that means the economy grew, but we didn't have to suffer any inflation in order to get the economic growth. That would be a pretty good deal. So let's see if it can get better still as we move along into the upward sloping section to, let's say, AD3. This time, we have more GDP like before, GDP 3, but this time, in terms of costs and benefits, the benefit was the increase in GDP. The cost was an increase in CPI, which is the same as saying we had to suffer some inflation to get that job growth. So here there are costs and benefits rather than simply economic growth without any inflation. But all along the way here, things are getting better and better and better and better until we get to the vertical section. Let's pick a point here and call it aggregate demand 4. This time we have very little growth in GDP and a whole lot of growth in CPI. So this time, the costs and benefits don't weigh out as well as they did before. This time, we're only getting a tiny amount of growth in GDP and a whole lot of growth in inflation. So at some point, the growth that we're getting compared to the inflation that we're suffering ceases to be worthwhile. So if there were a perfect place for the economy to be on this graph, we would choose it to be right here. I'm going to put the little square box just like I did for micro supply and demand. If we could choose, we'd like to be at this spot right here, which is called the full employment macroeconomic equilibrium. Full employment because the economy is producing all it can produce and creating the most jobs it can create. Macro because this is the macroeconomy. Equilibrium because that's the best place for supply and demand to intersect. In the real world, getting aggregate demand and GDP to move is much more difficult than I've made it seem here. But for the Learning Plan 9, what you need to look at is a graph like this, and then use the economic data in the case studies to make a determination of where we are. And then the last thing you're asked in that learning plan is to compare this to the phases of the business cycle. So this diagram is going to get just a bit cluttered, but watch along as we put that roller coaster of the business cycle that you can also find in your textbook. Superimpose it on here, it looks kind of like this. When things are getting better, we say that the economy is in a recovery. When we get to the maximum point, we call that the peak. Eventually, we decline from the peak to the recession, and when the recession bottoms out, the bottom of the economic cycle is called the trough, and then the cycle begins again. So I hope that will help you with the things that you need to do to understand the graphs in Learning Plan 9. Then in Learning Plan 10, you'll learn about how the government and business work together to get aggregate demand where it needs to go. Again, as before, if the explanations and the material that I've posted for you online, including the video, don't help you figure things out, please send me an email and we'll go from there.